Hi everyone, we're back for one last genre investigation. This time we are going to be looking at poems for two voices, and we're going to be using the OQC strategy. And what that stands for is observe, question, and compare. And so how this works is we're going to look through several poems for two voices together, and then we're going to write down some of the things that we observe about them, especially with that first one. And then after that, when we look at additional poems, we're going to start questioning them and comparing them with the other poems that we're reading. And so to give you kind of just a sense of what a poem for two voices is, because I'm sure there are quite a few of you who have never heard one, we're actually going to watch a video because they're really meant to be read by two people, and so I can't really do that by myself. And so I'm going to pull up the text of the poem so that you can kind of see how it's structured, and then I'll also pull up the video. And these are students that are performing this, so they're actually doing all these actions as well. And so try and look between the two, just so you kind of get a sense of how the poem is laid out on the paper and kind of how it works. Okay, so I'm going to pull this up. We'll go to honeybees. And then I'm going to just move this over just a bit so you can see both at the same time. Okay, I think that should work. Okay, so here we go. And again, the volume is all the way up. I hope it doesn't blast you. It's just some of these videos are a little quiet. So this is Honeybees. It's a poem by Paul Fleischman. And I'll just explain very quickly. So the lines that are together like this are said at the exact same time. And then this is one voice, and then this is another voice. And so then they alternate. And then again, they say at the same time. So you'll be able to see this, how that works in the video. Okay, here we go.
Being a bee is a joy,
is a pain.
I'm a queen.
I'm a worker.
I'll gladly explain. Upon rising, I'm fed by my royal attendants.
I'm up at dawn guarding the hive's narrow entrance.
I'm bathed.
Then I take out the hive's morning trash.
Then I'm groomed.
Then I put in an hour making wax without 2 minutes time to sit and relax.
The rest of my day is quite simply set forth.
Then I might go work in the field, 3 miles north.
I lay eggs.
Or perhaps I'm on larva detail,
By the hundred.
feeding the grubs in their cells, wishing that I were still helpless and pale.
I'm loved and I'm lauded. I'm outranked by none.
Then I pack the combs with pollen, not my idea of fun.
When I've done enough laying,
And weary I strive,
I retire
patch up any cracks in the hide.
for the rest of the day.
Then I build some new cells, slaving away at enlarging this hell, dreading the sight of another sunrise, wondering why we don't all unionize.
Truly, a bees is the best
Of all lives.
Okay, so there we go. So hopefully that gives you a good idea of what a poem for two voices looks like and sounds like when it's read out loud. And so now what I want to do is I just want to make some observations. Let's make some observations, and we'll even just start with this particular poem. And so we notice we already kind of talked about the format, but we notice that we have the two columns to indicate the different voices, and that when the words are on the same line, they're said at the same time. When they're on different lines, they're said differently at different times. They rotate. This one we can notice is kind contrasting these two different types of bees, and we're actually learning a lot about bees from this poem, right? This is really like an informational text. So we're learning about the jobs that a queen bee does. We're learning about the jobs that a worker bee does. But it's still in this kind of narrative tone and telling us like a little bit of a story, a little bit. And then with the two voices, we get a very distinct tone and air of the two different voices, right? We have our worker bee that sounds kind of disgruntled, and our queen who's sounds very royal and almost a little arrogant. And I think the two student performers did a really good job of showing that voice and performing that really well. And so the voices are really distinct in this poem, and we are definitely getting that compare-contrast aspect. And then one other thing that I noticed about this is that sometimes when they talk at the same time, they don't always say the exact same thing, right? In this case, they switched what they were saying. They said what was obviously true to their voice, but it wasn't the same. So they still said that in unison. So sometimes what the voices say in unison doesn't have to be the same. And so I'm going to write down some of these observations. So when we're observing, we're thinking about what we notice about layout and ideas, the interactions, the voice, and the word choice, right? And so we'll be thinking about that as well. So we notice the layout with the two columns, one for each voice, and then separate lines indicates when each voice talks individually, and then when the lines are together, or when the text is on the same line, the voices speak at the same time. And so this one is all about bees, obviously, but more than just thinking about these specific ideas, what I want you to think about when we're thinking about ideas is like how they're presented. So this one is really comparing and contrasting different types of bees, right? And so that's one, when we think about it in general terms, like the compare and contrast, then we can think like, oh, well, a poem for two voices could be used to compare and contrast two different things. So it wouldn't necessarily have to be bees, it could be something else, right? Okay, and the interactions, they're kind of, so in this one, they're not really talking to each other, they're kind of just sharing their own separate story, right? Sharing separate story. And that kind of feeds into that compare and contrast aspect as well. But the voice and tone is distinct for each bee, right? The worker versus the queen. And with that word choice, they're using words that are really specific to bees, right? Larva, and eggs, and the field to collect nectar and things like that. So vocabulary that's very specific to the topic. Okay, so now we're going to just go through the questions really quickly and think about why did the writer choose this layout? And obviously having those columns is really helpful because if you have the two voices speaking and you're going to be reading it at the same time, that makes it a lot easier to see when you're going to talk at the same time and when you're not, right? Okay, and then we have the ideas, and we already talked about that. How does the writer use the two voices? And we talked about that, like how they sound very different, that they are contrasting. They're not really even interacting with each other. They're more just telling their own experience as a bee. we could picture it as like, it may be like a documentary, right, where they interview one person and then they jump to interview the other one and then they come back and forth, right? We could kind of think about it in terms of that. And so the voices they do say similar things at similar times to create that rhythm, but they're not really totally interacting with each other, right? And why did the writer make these choices to convey this specific information? I think I would say probably with this, because they're comparing and contrasting, but they're not interacting, it's like they are just telling their own stories. And so I think that's why they aren't like responding to each other necessarily. And then we've already talked about the words as well. So now we're going to look at another poem. And so this one is quite different. So it's another poem for two voices, and I'm not going to read it aloud to you, but we're just going to look through it together. And so obviously we see that we have this title. We have a lot of images with it, the big cat, and then we again have these two columns, but then this time we have something in the middle. And so we can guess that the middle is probably what they say together. And then I'm also noticing that the columns are color-coded. And so that also helps. And then the middle is that different color. And then, and so let's just kind of look at kind of the ideas that are presented. So talking about the big cat, and there's these mice, right? And so we're kind of contrasting the mice. And so I actually am probably going to read a little just because I want to help us really think through the interactions between the voices. So, oh my, I spy a great big cat. A great big cat? I don't like that. Run, mice, run. Stay, cat, stay. Oh, good, the mice have got away. Now, pussycat, that isn't nice. You shouldn't scare the little mice. We know you want them for your food, but eating mice is really rude. It's not a proper thing to do. Why? What if someone gobbled you? Think how sad your friends would feel if you were eaten for a meal. We'll give you cream, your very own, if you will leave the mice alone, and when you're done and full and fat, we'll find a book about a cat like you with fluffy fur who laps up cream and loves to purr and lives inside a little house and never ever dines on mouse. We both will read the book to you. The mice can sit and listen too. Okay, so reading it out loud also helps us notice that there's rhyme going on in this poem, right? And we can see that the voices are really intersecting with each other. They're building on each other. It's definitely more of a conversation in this poem. And so I'm going to head back to the investigation sheet because I want to start jotting down some of these things. So in this one, we still have two columns. One for each voice. But the text they read together is in the middle. The columns and text are color-coded, which definitely helps, right? So the ideas are kind of portraying this little story, right? It's like pretty much a short story about a cat that's about to eat a mouse and they're trying to stop it, right? So this is just like a short story. So this is like more of a narrative, whereas the bees, this was more informational, right? Okay, and so they're interacting in a conversation. It's like very much a conversation with each other. And And the voice, they do sound different, but they do sound very similar. So they're not too different in terms of voice or personality. And then the word choice, let me go back. So with words, I'm actually they do give specific words that are very specific to cats and mice. And that idea, I like that they're using like some of these like very descriptive verbs like gobbled, and things like that. And then we can also talk about rhyme. So words specific to cats and mice, and then they are actually using rhyme. Okay, so now we're gonna really question this and compare it with the honeybees poem. So why did the writer choose this particular layout? Well, again, we have those two columns to show the different voices, and we have the color coding to also show those different voices, which is really helpful. And then the middle is where they speak together, which is nice. But when we compare that with the other one, we can really question and think about, okay, well, why did Paul Fleischman decide to put the text that they say together on just the same line and not in the middle? Well, and then if we think about the honeybees, like sometimes when they spoke together, they didn't say the same thing. So if we were just putting it in the middle, it wouldn't work, right? So it depends on what you want the voices to say, right? So sometimes, the honeybees poem put the voices speaking together on the same line so it can change so that they don't have to say the same thing. The cat poem puts them in the middle, but then the voices always have to say the same thing, right? So if we're kind of trying to compare and contrast something, then we probably would want to do it in the style of Paul Fleischman instead of the big cat poem, if that makes sense. And so with this one, though, again, when we're comparing, this poem is having the conversation. They're kind of in conversation with each other, where the other one it's just this own separate side-by-side stories. And they definitely connect to each other as they're talking about their days, and they align, but it's not like in response to the other person, right? Okay, so this one, so you could have the voices respond to each other or just kind of play off of each other, like in the honeybees poem. Like they kind of take one thing and then apply it to themselves, but they're not necessarily talking to each other. Okay. And now so I'm going to have you continue this investigation by looking at a couple of additional poems, and they'll be on the slides that follow. And so I want you to just continue to add to your investigation sheet to look at some of the different options that you have available to you when you're writing a poem for two voices. And then after that, I want you to, we're going to just kind of brainstorm some potential voices that you could use for your reaction paper. Okay, so very quickly, just as a reminder, so for your readings next week, you will be reading about writing strategies for special populations like students with disabilities or English learners. And so what I want you to do is just kind of brainstorm some potential voices that would work for those readings. And then just some ideas that you might want to try out in your poem. So I hope this helps. As always, please feel free to contact me or Margaret if you have any questions about the reaction paper, or even if you just need to brainstorm. We're more than happy to help. So thanks.